The 3324 podcast is pleased to present Holiday Treasury Volume 6. Read by Nick Leshi, Christy Cuomo, Sean Grady, and Dean Leggiero.
The Boy with the Box. It was an ideal Christmas day. The sun shone brightly, but the air was crisp and cold, and snow and ice lay sparkling everywhere. A light wind, the night before, had swept the blue, ice-bound river clean of scattering snow, and, by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the broad bend near Creighton's Mill was fairly alive with skaters. The girls in gay caps and scarfs, the boys in sweaters and mackinaws of every conceivable hue, with here and there a plump, matronly figure in a plush coat or a tiny fellow in scarlet, made a picture of life and brilliancy worthy of any artist's finest skill. Tom Reynolds moved in and out among the happy throng with swift, easy strokes, his cap on the back of his curly head, and his brown eyes shining with excitement. Now and again, he glanced down with pardonable pride at the brand-new skates that twinkled beneath his feet. Jolly Ramblers, sure enough jolly Ramblers they were. Ever since Ralph Evans had remarked, with a tantalizing toss of his handsome head, that no game fellow would try to skate on anything but Jolly Ramblers, Tom had yearned with an inexpressible longing for a pair of these wonderful skates. And now they were his, and the ice was fine, and the Christmas sun was shining. Tom was rounding the Big Bend for the 50th time, when he saw, skimming gracefully toward him through the merry crowd, a tall boy in a fur-trimmed coat, his handsome head proudly erect. "That's Ralph Evans now," said Tom to himself. "Just wait till you see these skates, old boy, and maybe you won't feel so smart." And with slow, cautious strokes, he made his way through laughing boys and girls to a place just in front of the tall skater, coming toward him down the broad white way. When Ralph was almost upon him, Tom paused and in conspicuous silence looked down at his shining skates. "Hello," said Ralph good-naturedly, seizing Tom's arm and swinging around. Then, taking in the situation with a careless glance, he added, "Get a new pair of skates for Christmas?" "Jolly Ramblers," said Tom impressively, "the best Jolly Ramblers in the market." Ralph was a full half-head the taller, but as Tom delivered himself of this speech with his head held high, he felt every inch as tall as the boy before him. If Ralph was deeply impressed, he failed to show it, as he answered carelessly, "Huh, that's so. Pretty good little skates they are, the Jolly Ramblers." "You said no game fellow would use any other make," said Tom hotly. "Oh, but that was nearly a year ago," said Ralph. "I got a new pair of skates for Christmas, too," he added, as if it had just occurred to him. "Clubhouse skates, something new in the market just this season. Just look at the curve of that skate, will you?" he added, lifting a foot for inspection. "And that clamp that you couldn't shake off if you had to. They're guaranteed for a year, too, and if anything gives out, you get a new pair for nothing. $3.50 they cost at Mr. Harrison's hardware store. I gave my Jolly Ramblers to a kid about your size. A mighty good little skate they are." And, with a long, graceful stroke, Ralph Evans skated away. And it seemed to Tom Reynolds that all his Christmas joy went skimming away behind him. The sun still shone, the ice still gleamed, the skaters laughed and sang, but Tom moved slowly on, with listless, heavy strokes. The Jolly Ramblers still twinkled beneath his feet, but he looked down at them no more. What was the use of Jolly Ramblers when Ralph Evans had a pair of clubhouse skates that cost $1 more, had a graceful curve and a faultless clamp, and were guaranteed for a year? It was only 4 o'clock when Tom slipped his new skates carelessly over his shoulder and started up the bank for home. He was slouching down the main street, head down, hands thrust deep into his pockets, when, on turning a corner, he ran plump into a full moon. Now I know it is rather unusual for full moons to be walking about the streets by daylight, but that is the only adequate description of the round, freckled face that beamed at Tom from behind a great box held by two sturdy arms. "That came pretty near being a collision," said the owner of the full moon, still beaming as he set down the box and leaned against a building to rest a moment. "Nobody hurt, I guess," said Tom. "Been down to the ice?" asked the boy eagerly. "I could see the skaters from Patton's store." "Oh, I see you got some new skates for Christmas. Ain't they beauties now?" And he beamed on the despised Jolly Ramblers with his heart in his little blue eyes. "A pretty good little pair of skates," said Tom in Ralph's condescending tone. "Good! Well, I should guess yes. And Christmas ice just made a purpose." In spite of his ill humor, Tom could not help responding to the warm interest of the shabby boy at his side. He knew him to be Harvey McGinnis, the son of a poor Irish widow who worked at Patton's department store out of school hours. Looking at the great box with an awakening interest, he remarked kindly, "What you been doing with yourself on Christmas Day?" "Want to know, sure enough?" said Harvey mysteriously, his round face beaming more brightly than ever. "Well, I've been doing this Santa Claus act down at Patton's store. About a week ago," he went on, leaning back easily against a tall building and thrusting his hands down deep into his well-worn pockets, "about a week ago, as I was cleaning out the storeroom, I came on 3 big boxes with broken dolls in 'em. Beauties they were, I can tell you. The Lady Jane in a blue silk dress, the Lady Clarabelle in pink, and the Lady Matilda in shimmerin' white. Nothing wrong with 'em either, only broken rubbers that put their jints out of whack and set their heads a-rollin' this way and that. They could be fixed in no time, I says to myself, and what a prize they'd be for the kids, to be sure. For Mom and me had racked our brains considerable how we'd scrape together the money for Christmas things for the girls. So I went to the boss and I asked him right out what he'd charge me for the 3 ladies just as they was, and he says, 'Jimmy,' he says, I've told him my name a dozen times, but he allus calls me Jimmy. 'Jimmy,' he says, 'if you'll come down on Christmas Day and help me take down the fixin's and fix up the store for regular trade, I'll give you the dolls for nothing,' he says. So I explained to the kids that Santy'd be late to our house this year, with so many to see after it wouldn't be strange, and went down to the store early this morning and finished me work and fixed up the ladies as good as new. Would you like to be seeing them now?" he added, turning to the great box with a look of pride. "Sure, I'd like to see 'em," said Tom, with careful, almost reverent touch. Harvey untied the string and opened the large box, disclosing 3 smaller boxes, one above the other. Opening the first box, he revealed a really handsome doll in a blue silk dress, with large, dark eyes that opened and shut, and dark, curling locks of real hair. "This is the Lady Jane," he said, smoothing her gay frock with gentle fingers. "We're going to give her to Kitty. Kitty's hair is pretty and curly, but she hates it 'cause it's red, and she thinks black hair is the prettiest kind in the world. Ain't it funny how all of us will be wanting what we don't have ourselves?" Tom did not reply to this bit of philosophy, but he laid a repentant hand on the Jolly Ramblers, as if he knew he had wronged them in his heart. "That's as handsome a doll as ever I saw, and no mistake," he said. Pleased with this praise, Harvey opened the second box and disclosed the Lady Matilda, with fair golden curls and a dress of shimmerin' white. "The Lady Matilda goes to Josephine," said Harvey. "Josephine has black hair, straight as a string, and won't she laugh, though, to see them fetchin' yellow curls?" "She surely ought to be glad," said Tom. The Lady Clarabelle was another fair-haired lady in a gown of the brightest pink. "This here beauty's for the baby," said Harvey, his eyes glowing. "She don't care if the hair's black or yellow, but won't that stunning dress make her eyes pop out?" "They'll surely believe in Santy when they see those beauties," said Tom. "That's just what I was saying to Mom this morning," said Harvey. Kitty's had some doubts. She's almost 9. But when she sees those fine ladies, she'll be dead sure Mom and I didn't buy 'em. If I had a Santa Claus suit, I'd dress up and hand 'em out myself." Tom's face lighted with a bright idea. "My brother Bob's got a Santa Claus suit that he used in a show last Christmas," he said. "Say, let me dress up and play Santa for you. The girls would never guess who I was." "Wouldn't they stare, though?" said Harvey delightedly. "But do you think you'd want to take time?" he asked apologetically. "And you with a new pair of skates and the ice like this." "Of course I want to if you'll let me," said Tom. "I'll skate down the river and meet you anywhere you say." "Out in our backyard, then, at 7 o'clock," said Harvey. "All right, I'll be there." And with head up and skates clinking, Tom hurried away. It was a flushed, excited boy who burst into the Reynolds' quiet sitting room a few minutes later, with his skates still hanging on his shoulder and his cap in his hand. "Say, Mother," he cried, "can I have Bob's Santa Claus suit this evening, please? I'm going to play Santa Claus for Harvey McGinnis." "Play Santa Claus for Harvey McGinnis? What do you mean, child?" "You know Mrs. McGinnis, Mother, that poor woman who lives in the little house by the river. Her husband got killed on the railroad last winter, you know. Well, Harvey, her boy, has fixed up some grand-looking dolls for his sisters, and he wants me to come out and play Santa tonight." And Tom launched out into a long story about Harvey and his good fortune. "He must be a splendid boy," said Mrs. Reynolds heartily, "and I am sure I shall be glad to have you go." "And another thing, Mother," said Tom, hesitating a little. "Do you think Grandma would care if I spent part of that $5 she gave me for a pair of skates for Harvey? He hasn't any skates at all, and I know he'd just love to have some." "It is generous of you to think of it," said his mother, much pleased, "and you would still have 2.5 for that little trip down to Grandma's." "But I'd like to get him some clubhouse skates," said Tom. "They're a new kind that cost $3.50. "But I thought you said the Jolly Ramblers were the best skates made." Mrs. Reynolds looked somewhat hurt as she glanced from Tom to the skates on his shoulder and back to Tom again. "They are, Mother. They're just dandies," said Tom, blushing with shame that he could ever have despised his mother's gift. "But these clubhouse skates are just the kind for Harvey. You see, Harvey's shoes are old and worn, and these clubhouse skates have clamps that you can't shake loose if you have to. Then, if anything happens to them before the year's up, you get a new pair free. And Harvey, wouldn't have any money to be fixing skates." "Well, do as you like," said Mrs. Reynolds, pleased with Tom's eagerness, for such a spell of generosity was something new in her selfish younger son. "But remember, you will have to wait a while for your visit to Grandma." "All right, and thank you, Mother," said Tom. "You can buy the skates down at Harrison's, and I'm going over and ask Mr. Harrison if he won't open up the store and get a pair for me for a special time like this. I'm most sure he will." And away he flew. That evening, at 7, as the moon was rising over the eastern hills, a short, portly Santa Claus stepped out of the dry reeds by the river bank and walked with wonderfully nimble feet right into the McGinnis's little backyard. As he neared the small back porch, a dark figure rose to greet him, one hand held up in warning, the other holding at arm's length a bulky grain sack full to the brim. "Here's your pack, Santy," he whispered gleefully. "They're all waiting in the front room yonder. I'll slip in the back way, whilst you go round and give a good thump at the front door, and Mom'll let you in." Trembling with eagerness, Tom tiptoed round the house, managing to slip an oblong package into the capacious depths of the big sack as he did so. Thump, thump, how his knock re-echoed in the frosty air. The door swung wide, and Mrs. McGinnis's gaunt figure stood before him. "Good evening, Santy. Come right in," she said. Tom had always thought what a homely woman Harvey's mother was when he happened to meet her at the grocery, with her thin red hair drawn severely back from her gaunt face and a black shawl over her head. But as he looked up into her big, kind face, so full of Christmas sunshine He wondered he could ever have thought her anything but lovely. The room was small and bare, but wonderfully gay with pine and bits of red and green crepe paper, saved from the fixins of the store. And on a large bed in the corner sat the 3 little girls, Kitty with her bright curls bobbing, Josephine with her black braids sticking straight out, and the baby with tiny blue eyes that twinkled and shone like Harvey's. The fine speech that Tom had been saying over to himself for the past 2 hours seemed to vanish into thin air before this excited little audience. But in faltering, stammering tones, which everyone was too excited to notice, he managed to say something about Merry Christmas and good children, and then proceeded to open the magic sack. Miss Kitty McGinnis, he called in deep, gruff tones. Kitty took the box he offered with shy embarrassment, slowly drew back the lid, and gave a cry of amazement and delight. A doll! Oh, the loveliest doll that ever was, she cried. Then turning to her brother, she whispered as softly as excitement would permit, Oh, Harvey, I'm afeard you paid too much. Aw, go on, said Harvey, his face more like a full moon than ever. Don't you know that Santa can do whatever he wants to? The other dolls were received with raptures, Josephine stroking the golden curls of the Lady Matilda with wondering fingers, and the baby dancing round and round, waving the pink-robed Lady Clarabelle above her head. Mr. Harvey McGinnis, came the gruff tones of Santa Claus, and Harvey smiled over to his mother as he drew out a pair of stout cloth gloves. Mrs. McGinnis, and that good lady smiled back as she shook out a dainty white apron with a coarse embroidery ruffle. I reckon Santy wanted you to wear that of a Sunday afternoon, said Harvey awkwardly. And I'll be proud to do it, said his mother. Little sacks of candy were next produced, and everyone settled down to enjoy it, thinking that the bottom of the big sack must be reached, when Santa called out in tones that trembled beneath the gruffness, Another package for Mr. Harvey McGinnis. For me? Why, what? Said Harvey, taking the heavy oblong bundle. Then, as the sparkling clubhouse skates met his view, his face lit up with a glory that Tom never forgot. The glory lasted but a moment. Then he turned a troubled face toward the bulky old saint. You never ought to have done it, he said. These must have cost a lot. Ah, go on, was the reply in a distinctly boyish tone. Don't you know that Santa can do whatever he wants to? And with a prodigious bow, old Santa was gone. A few minutes later, a slender boy with a bundle under his arm was skating swiftly down the shining river in the moonlight. As he rounded the bend, a tall figure in a fur-trimmed coat came skimming slowly toward him, and a voice called out in Ralph Evans's condescending tones, Well, how are the Jolly Ramblers doing tonight? But the answer this time was clear and glad and triumphant. The best in the world, said Tom. And isn't this the glorious night for skating?
Christmas Day. Boys, said Mrs. Howard one morning, looking up from a letter she was reading, I have had a letter from your grandmamma. She writes that she is returning to England shortly. The boys went on with their breakfast without showing any great amount of interest in this piece of news, for they had never seen their grandmother, and therefore could not very well be expected to show any affection for her. Now Mrs. Howard, the mother of 2 of the boys and aunt to the 3rd little fellow, was a widow and very poor, and often found it a hard task to provide for her 3 boys, as she called them, for, having adopted her little orphan nephew, she always treated him as her own son. She had sometimes thought it strange that old Mrs. Howard should not have offered to provide for Leslie herself, but she had never done so, and at last Mrs. Howard had ceased to expect it. But now, right at the end of her letter, Grandmamma Howard wrote, I have been thinking that perhaps it would come a little hard on you to support not only your own 2 boys, but poor Alice's son. And so On my return to England, I propose, if you are willing, to adopt one of them. For I am a lonely old woman and shall be glad of a young face about me again." After thinking the matter over, Mrs. Howard decided she would say nothing about their grandmother's intention to the boys, as she thought that it was just possible she might change her mind again. Time passed on, and winter set in, and full of the delights of skating, the boys forgot all about the expected arrival of their grandmother. During the Christmas holidays, the boys one morning started off to Broom Meadow for a good day's skating on the pond there. They carried their dinner with them and were told to be sure and be home before dark. As they ran along the frosty road, they came suddenly upon a poor old woman, so suddenly that Leslie ran right up against her before he could stop himself. The old woman grumbled about, "Lazy, selfish boys, only thinking of their own pleasure and not caring what happened to a poor old woman." But Leslie stopped at once and apologized, in his polite little way, for his carelessness. "I am sorry," he said. "I hope I did not hurt you. And you have such heavy parcels to carry, too. Won't you let me help you?" "Oh, come on, Leslie," said his cousins. "We shall never get to the pond at this rate." "Yes, go on," said the old woman sharply. "Your skating is of a great deal more importance than an old woman, eh?" But Leslie's only answer was to take the parcels and trudge merrily along beside his companion. On the way to her cottage, the old woman asked him all sorts of questions about himself and his cousins, and then, having reached her cottage, dismissed him with scarcely a thank you for the trouble he had taken. But Leslie did not take it much to heart. He raced along, trying his hardest to overtake his cousins before they reached the pond, and was soon skimming about with the rest of them. Squire Leholm, in whose grounds the boys were skating, afterwards came down to the pond to watch the fun, and being a kind-hearted old gentleman, offered to give a prize of a new pair of skates to the boy who should win the greatest number of races. As it was getting late, it was arranged that the racing should come off on the following day, and the squire invited all the boys who took part in it to come up to his house to a substantial tea after the fun was over. How delighted Leslie was, for he was a first-rate skater, and he did so want a new pair of skates. But the squire's skates were not to be won by him, for on the following day, as he and his cousins were on their way to the pond, they came across the queer old woman whom they had met on the previous day. She was sitting on the ground and seemed to be in great pain. The boys stopped to ask what ailed her, and she told them that she had slipped and twisted her foot and was afraid that her ankle was sprained, for she could not bear to put it to the ground. "You mustn't sit here in the cold," said Leslie. "Come, try and get up, and I will help you home." "Oh, Leslie," cried both his cousins, "don't go. You will be late for the races and lose your chance of the prize." Poor Leslie. He turned first red, then white, and then said in a husky tone of voice, "Never mind. You go on without me." "You're a good laddie," said the old woman. "Will you be very sorry to miss the fun?" Leslie muttered something about not minding much, and then the brave little fellow set himself to help the poor old woman home as gently and tenderly as he could. She would not let him come in with her, but told him to run off as quickly as he could, and perhaps after all, he would not be too late for the skating. But Leslie could not bear to leave her alone and in pain, so he decided to run home and fetch his aunt. When Mrs. Howard arrived at the cottage, you can think how surprised she was to find that Leslie's poor old woman was none other than Grandmama Howard herself, who, wishing to find out the real characters of her grandsons, had chosen to come in this disguise to the little village where they lived. You will easily guess which of the three boys Grandmama chose to be her little companion. And oh, what a lovely Grandmama she was, as not only Leslie, but his cousins too, found out. She always seemed to know exactly what a boy wanted, and still better, to give it to him. Walter and Stanley often felt terribly ashamed of the selfish manner in which they had behaved, and wished they were more like Leslie. But Grandmama told them that it was never too late to mend, and they took her advice. And I am quite sure that at the present moment, if they were to meet a poor old woman in distress by the roadside, they would not pass her by, as they once did Grandmama Howard.
Little Will's message. It is that or starve, Captain. I can't get a job. God knows I've tried. But without a recommend, it's no use. I ain't no good at begging. And then there's the children. There was a desperate note in the man's voice that made the captain turn and look sharply at him. A swarthy, strongly built man in a rough coat, and with that in his dark face which told that he had lived longer than his years, stood at the door of the detective office. His hand that gripped the door handle shook so that the knob rattled in his grasp, but not with fear. He was no stranger to that place. Black Bill's face had looked out from the rogues gallery longer than most of those now there could remember. The captain looked him over in silence. "You'd better not, Bill," he said. "You know what will come of it. When you go up again, it will be the last time. And up you go, sure." The man started to say something, but choked it down and went out without a word. The captain got up and rang his bell. "Bill, who was here just now, is off again," he said to the officer who came to the door. "He says it's steal or starve, and he can't get a job. I guess he is right. Who wants a thief in his pay? And how can I recommend him? And still, I think he would keep straight if he had the chance. Tell Murphy to look after him and see what he's up to." Captain went out, tugging viciously at his gloves. He was in very bad humor. The policeman at the Mulberry Street door got hardly a nod for his cheery "Merry Christmas" as he passed. "Wonder what's crossed him," he said, looking down the street after him. The green lamps were lighted and shone upon the hurrying 6 o'clock crowds from the Broadway shops. In the great business buildings, the iron shutters were pulled down and the lights put out, and in a little while the reporters' boys that carried slips from headquarters to the newspaper offices across the street were the only tenants of the block. A stray policeman stopped now and then on the corner and tapped the lamppost reflectively with his club as he looked down the deserted street and wondered, as his glance rested upon the chief's darkened windows, how it felt to have $6,000 a year and every night off. In the detective office, the sergeant, who had come in at roll call, stretched himself behind the desk and thought of home. The lights of a Christmas tree in the abutting Mott Street tenement shone through his window, and the laughter of children mingled with the tap of the toy drum. He pulled down the sash in order to hear better. As he did so, a strong draught swept his desk. The outer door slammed. 2 detectives came in, bringing a prisoner between them. A woman accompanied them. The sergeant pulled the blotter toward him mechanically and dipped his pen. "What's the charge?" he asked. "Picking pockets, 14th Street. The lady's the complainant, Mrs. The name was that of a well-known police magistrate. The sergeant looked up and bowed. His glance took in the prisoner, and a look of recognition came into his face. "What, Bill, so soon?" he said. The prisoner was sullenly silent. He answered the questions put to him briefly, and was searched. The stolen pocketbook, a small paper package, and a crumpled letter were laid upon the desk. The sergeant saw only the pocketbook. "Looks bad," he said, with a wrinkled brow. "We caught him at it," explained the officer. "Guess Bill has lost his heart. Didn't seem to care. Didn't even try to get away." The prisoner was taken to a cell. Silence fell once more upon the office. The sergeant had made a few red lines in the blotter and resumed his reveries. He was not in a mood for work. He hitched his chair nearer the window and looked across the yard. But the lights there were put out. The children's laughter had died away. Out of sorts at he hardly knew what, he leaned back in his chair with his hands under the back of his head. Here it was Christmas Eve, and he at the desk instead of being out with the old woman buying things for the children. He thought with a sudden pang of conscience of the sled he had promised to get for Johnny, and he had forgotten. That was hard luck. And what would Katie say when he had got that far, when his eye, roaming idly over the desk, rested upon the little package taken from the thief's pocket? Something about it seemed to move him with sudden interest. He sat up and reached for it. He felt it carefully all over. Then he undid the package slowly and drew forth a woolly sheep. It had a blue ribbon about its neck, with a tiny bell hung on it. The sergeant set the sheep upon the desk and looked at it fixedly for better than a minute. Having apparently studied out its mechanism, he pulled its head, and it bad. He pulled it once more and nodded. Then he took up the crumpled letter and opened it. This was what he read, scrawled in a child's uncertain hand. Dear Santa Claus, please won't you bring me a sheep, what baz? Aggie had one onct, and Kate wants a dolly awful. In the rear, 718 19th Street, by the gas house. Your friend, Will. The sergeant read it over twice, very carefully, and glanced over the page at the sheep, as if taking stock and wondering why Kate's dolly was not there. Then he took the sheep and the letter and went over to the captain's door. A gruff, "Come in," answered his knock. The captain was pulling off his overcoat. He had just come in from his dinner. "Captain," said the sergeant, "we found this in the pocket of Black Bill, who's locked up picking Mrs. Pocket an hour ago. It's a clear case. They didn't even try to give him the slip." And he set the sheep upon the table and laid the letter beside it. "Black Bill?" said the captain with something of a start. "The dickens you say?" And he took up the letter and read it. He was not a very good penman, was little Will. The captain had even a harder time of it than the sergeant had had making out his message. 3 times he went over it, spelling out the words, and each time comparing it with the woolly exhibit that was part of the evidence, before he seemed to understand. Then it was in a voice that would have frightened little Will very much could he have heard it, and with a black look under his bushy eyebrows, that he bade the sergeant, "Fetch Bill up here." One might almost have expected the little white lamb to have taken to its heels with fright at having raised such a storm, could it have run at all. But it showed no signs of fear. On the contrary, it bad quite lustily when the sergeant should have been safely out of earshot. The hand of the captain had accidentally rested upon the woolly head in putting down the letter, but the sergeant was not out of earshot. He heard it and grinned. An iron door in the basement clanged, and there were steps in the passageway. The doorman brought in Bill. He stood by the door, sullenly submissive. Captain raised his head. It was in the shade. "So you're back, are you?" he said. The thief nodded. The captain bent his brows upon him and said with sudden fierceness, "You couldn't keep honest a month, could you?" "They wouldn't let me. Who wants a thief in his pay? And the children were starving." It was said patiently enough, but it made the captain wince all the same. They were his own words. But he did not give in so easily. "Starving," he repeated harshly. "And that's why you got this, I suppose?" And he pushed the sheep from under the newspaper that had fallen upon it by accident and covered it up. The thief looked at it and flushed to the temples. He tried to speak, but could not. His face worked, and he seemed to be strangling. In the middle of his fight to master himself, he saw the child's crumpled message on the desk. Taking a quick step across the room, he snatched it up, wildly, fiercely. "Captain!" he gasped, and broke down utterly. The hardened thief wept like a woman. The captain rang his bell. He stood with his back to the prisoner when the doorman came in. "Take him down," he commanded, and the iron door clanged once more behind the prisoner. 10 minutes later, the reporters were discussing across the way the nature of the case which the night promised to develop. They had piped off the captain and one of his trusted men leaving the building together, bound east. Could they have followed them all the way, they would have seen them get off the car at 19th Street and go towards the gas house, carefully scanning the numbers of the houses as they went. They found one at last, before which they halted. The captain searched in his pocket and drew forth the baby's letter to Santa Claus, and they examined the number under the gas lamp. Yes, that was right. The door was open, and they went right through it to the rear. Up in the third story, 3 little noses were flattened against the window pane, and 3 childish mouths were breathing peepholes through which to keep a lookout for the expected Santa Claus. It was cold, for there was no fire in the room, but in their fever of excitement, the children didn't mind that. They were bestowing all their attention upon keeping the peepholes open. "Do you think he will come?" asked the oldest boy. There were 2 boys and a girl, of Kate. "Yes, he will. I know he will. Papa said so," said the child in a tone of conviction. "I'm so hungry, and I want my sheep," said baby Will. "Wait and I'll tell you of the wolf," said his sister, and she took him on her lap. She had barely started when there were steps on the stairs and a tap on the door. Before the half-frightened children could answer, it was pushed open. 2 men stood on the threshold. One wore a big fur overcoat. The baby looked at him in wide-eyed wonder. "Is you Santa Claus?" he asked. "Yes, my little man. And are you baby Will?" said a voice that was singularly different from the harsh one baby Will's father had heard so recently in the captain's office, and yet very like it. "See? This is for you, I guess." And out of the big, roomy pocket came the woolly sheep and bad right off, as if it were his own pasture in which he was at home. And well might any sheep be content, nestling at a baby's heart so brimful of happiness as was little Will's was then, child of a thief though he was. "Papa spoke for it, and he spoke for Kate too, and I guess for everybody," said the bogus Santa Claus. "And it is all right. Now we will just get to work and make ready for him. All help." The sergeant behind the desk in the detective office might have had a fit had he been able to witness the goings-on in that rear tenement in the next hour. And then again, he might not. There's no telling about those sergeants. The way that poor flat laid itself out of a sudden was fairly staggering. It was not only that a fire was made and that the pantry was filled up in the most extraordinary manner, but a real Christmas tree sprang up, out of the floor, as it were, and was found to be all besprinkled with gold and stars and cornucopias with sugar plums. From the top of it, which was not higher than Santa Claus could easily reach, because the ceiling was low, a marvelous doll with real hair and with eyes that could open and shut looked down with arms wide open to take Kate to its soft wax heart. Under the branches of the tree browsed every animal that went into and came out of Noah's Ark, and there were glorious games of messenger boy and 3 bad bears, and honey cakes and candy apples, and a little yellow bird in a cage, and whatnot. It was glorious, and when the tea kettle began to sing, skillfully manipulated by Santa Claus' assistant, who nominally was known in Mulberry Street as Detective Sergeant Murphy, it was just too lovely for anything. The baby's eyes grew wider and wider, and Kate's were shining with happiness, when in the midst of it all, she suddenly stopped and said, "But where's Papa? Why don't he come?" Santa Claus gave a little start at the sudden question, but pulled himself together right away. "Why, yes," he said. He must have got lost. Now you are all right. We will just go and see if we can find him. Mrs. McCarthy here next door will help you keep the kettle boiling and the lights burning till we come back. Just let me hear the sheep baa once more. That's right. I bet we'll find Papa." And out they went. An hour later, while the magistrate, and his good wife were viewing with mock dismay the array of little stockings at the hearth in their fine uptown house, and talking of the adventure of his wife with the pickpocket, there came a ring at the doorbell, and the captain of the detectives was ushered in. What he told them, I do not know, but this I do know, that when he went away, the honorable magistrate went with him, and his wife waved goodbye to them from the stoop with wet eyes as they drove away in a carriage hastily ordered from a livery stable. While they drove downtown, the magistrate's wife went up to the nursery and hugged their sleeping little ones, one after the other, and teardrops fell upon their warm cheeks that had wiped out the guilt of more than one sinner before, and the children smiled in their sleep. They say among the simple-minded folk of faraway Denmark that then they see angels in their dreams. The carriage stopped in Mulberry Street, in front of police headquarters, and there was a great scurrying among the reporters, for now they were sure of their case. But no prominent citizen came out, made free by the magistrate, who opened the court in the captain's office. Only a rough-looking man with a flushed face, whom no one knew, and who stopped on the corner and looked back as one in a dream and then went east, the way the captain and his man had gone on their expedition, personating no less exalted a personage than Santa Claus himself. That night there was Christmas, indeed, in the rear tenement, near the gas house, for Papa had come home just in time to share in its cheer, and there was no one who did it with a better will, for the Christmas evening that began so badly was the luckiest night in his life. He had the promise of a job on the morrow in his pocket, along with something to keep the wolf from the door in the holidays. His hard days were over, and he was at last to have his chance to live an honest life. And it was the baby's letter to Santa Claus and the baa of a sheep that did it all, with the able assistance of the captain and the sergeant. Don't let us forget the sergeant.
Joel's talk with Santa Claus. One Christmas Eve, Joel Baker was in a most unhappy mood. He was lonesome and miserable. The chimes making Merry Christmas music outside disturbed rather than soothed him. The jingle of the sleigh bells fretted him, and the shrill whistling of the wind around the corners of the house up and down the chimney seemed to grate harshly on his ears. "Huh," said Joel wearily. "Christmas is nothing to me. There was a time when it meant a great deal, but that was long ago. 50 years is a long stretch to look back over. There's nothing in Christmas now, nothing for me at least. It is so long since Santa Claus remembered me that I venture to say he's forgotten that there ever was such a person as Joel Baker in all the world. It used to be different. Santa Claus used to think a great deal of me when I was a boy. Christmas nowadays ain't what it was in the good old time. No, not what it used to be." As Joel was absorbed in his distressing thoughts, he became aware very suddenly that somebody was entering or trying to enter the room. First came a draft of cold air, then a scraping, grating sound, then a strange shuffling, and then, all at once, Joel saw a pair of fat legs and still a fatter body dangle down the chimney, followed presently by a long white beard, above which appeared a jolly red nose and 2 bright twinkling eyes, while over the head and forehead was drawn a fur cap, white with snowflakes. "Ha, ha, 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 ha," chuckled the fat, jolly stranger, emerging from the chimney and standing well to one side of the hearthstone. "Ha, ha, ha. They don't have the big, wide chimneys they used to build, but they can't keep Santa Claus out. No, they can't keep Santa Claus out. Ha, 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 ha. Though the chimney were no bigger than a gas pipe, Santa Claus would slide down it." It didn't require a second glance to assure Joel that the newcomer was indeed Santa Claus. Joel knew the good old saint. Oh, yes, and he had seen him once before. And although that was when Joel was a little boy, he had never forgotten how Santa Claus looked. Nor had Santa Claus forgotten Joel, although Joel thought he had. For now Santa Claus looked kindly at Joel and smiled and said, "Merry Christmas to you, Joel." "Thank you, old Santa Claus," replied Joel, "but I don't believe it's going to be a very Merry Christmas." It's been so long since I've had a Merry Christmas that I don't believe I'd know how to act if I had one." "Let's see," said Santa Claus. "It must be going on 50 years since I saw you last. Yes, you were 8 years old the last time I slipped down the chimney of the old homestead and filled your stocking. Do you remember it?" "I remember it well," answered Joel. "I had made up my mind to lie awake and see Santa Claus. I had heard tell of you, but I had never seen you. And Brother and Otis and I concluded we'd lie awake and watch for you to come." Santa Claus shook his head reproachfully. "That was very wrong," said he, "for I am so scary that if I'd known you boys were awake, I'd have never come down the chimney at all, and then you'd have had no presents." "But Otis couldn't keep awake," explained Joel. "We talked about everything we could think of, till Father called out to us that if we didn't stop talking, he'd have to send one of us up into the attic to sleep with the hired man. So in less than 5 minutes, Otis was sound asleep, and no pinching could wake him up. But I was bound to see Santa Claus, and I don't believe anything would have put me to sleep. I heard the big clock in the sitting room strike 11, and I begun wondering if you were never going to come, when all of a sudden I heard the tinkle of the bells round your reindeers' necks. Then I heard the reindeers prancing on the roof, and the sound of your sleigh runners cutting through the crust and slipping over the shingles. I was kind of scared, and I covered up my head with the sheet and quilts, only I left a little hole so I could see and peek out and see what was going on. As soon as I saw you, I got over being scared, for you were jolly and smiling like, and you chuckled as you went around to each stocking and filled it up." "Yes, I can remember the night," said Santa Claus. "I brought you a sled, didn't I?" "Yes, and you brought Otis one too," replied Joel. "Mine was red and had Yankee Doodle painted in black letters on the side. Otis's was black and had Snow Queen in gilt letters." "I remember those sleds distinctly," said Santa Claus, "for I made them specially for you boys." "You set the sleds up against the wall," continued Joel, "and then you filled the stockings." "There were 6 of 'em, as I recollect," said Santa Claus. "Let me see," queried Joel. "There was mine, and Otis's, and Elvira's, and Thankful's, and Susan Prickett's. Susan was our help, you know. No, there were only 5, and as I remember, they were the biggest we could beg or borrow of Aunt Dorcas, who weighed nigh unto 200 pounds. Otis and I didn't like Susan Prickett, and we were hoping you'd put a cold potato in her stocking." "But Susan was a good girl," remonstrated Santa Claus. "You know, I put cold potatoes only in the stockings of boys and girls who are bad and don't believe in Santa Claus." "At any rate," said Joel, "you filled all the stockings with candy and popcorn and nuts and raisins, and I can remember you said you were afraid you'd run out of popcorn balls before you got around. And then you left each of us a book. Elvira got the best one, which was The Garland of Friendship, and had poems in it about the bleeding of hearts and so forth. Father wasn't expecting anything, but you left him a new pair of mittens, and Mother got a new fur boa to wear to meeting." "Of course," said Santa Claus. "I never forgot Father and Mother." "Well, it was as much as I could do to lay still," continued Joel, "for I'd been longing for a sled, and the sight of that red sled with Yankee Doodle painted on it just made me wild. But somehow or other, I began to get powerful sleepy all at once, and I couldn't keep my eyes open. Next thing I knew, Otis was nudging me on the ribs. 'Get up, Joel,' says he. 'It's Christmas, and Santa Claus has been here.' 'Merry Christmas, Merry Christmas,' we cried as we tumbled out of bed. Then Elvira and Thankful came in, not more than half dressed, and Susan came in too, and we just made Rome howl with Merry Christmas to each other. 'If you children don't make less noise in there,' cried Father, 'I'll have to send you all back to bed.' The idea of asking boys and girls to keep quiet on Christmas morning when they got new sleds and garlands of friendship." Santa Claus chuckled. His rosy cheeks fairly beamed joy. "Otis and I didn't want any breakfast," said Joel. "We made up our minds that a stocking full of candy and popcorn and raisins would stay us for a while. I do believe there wasn't buckwheat cakes enough in the township to keep us indoors that morning. Buckwheat cakes don't size up much alongside the red sled with Yankee Doodle painted onto it and a black sled named Snow Queen. We didn't care how cold it was. So much the better for sliding downhill. All the boys had new sleds. Leif Dawson, Bill Holbrook, Gum Adams, Rube Playford, Leander Merrick, Ezra Purple. All of them had new sleds, except Martin Peavy. And he said he calculated Santa Claus had skipped him this year because his father had broke his leg hauling logs from the Pelham Woods and had been kept indoors 6 weeks. But Martin had his old sled, and he didn't have to ask any odds of us either. I brought Martin a sled the next Christmas, said Santa Claus. Like as not. But did you ever slide down hills, Santa Claus? I don't mean such hills as they have out here in this new country, but one of them old-fashioned New England hills that was made specially for boys to slide down, full of bumpers and thank-ye marms, and about 10 times longer coming up than it is going down. The wind blew in our faces and almost took our breath away. Merry Christmas to you, little boys, it seemed to say, and it untied our mufflers and whirled the snow in our faces, just as if it was a boy, too, and wanted to play with us. An old crow came flapping over from the cornfield beyond the meadow. He said, "Caw, caw," when he saw my new sled. Suppose he'd never seen a red one before. Otis had a hard time with his sled, and the black one, and he wondered why it wouldn't go as fast as mine could. "Have you scraped the paint off the runners?" asked Wallesley Goodnow. "Of course I have," said Otis. "Broke my own knife and Lute Ingram's a-doing it, but we don't seem to make no difference. The darn old thing won't go." Then, what did Simon Buzzell say, but like it or not, it was because Otis's sled name was Snow Queen. "Never did see a girl sled that was worth a cent anyway," says Simon. Well, now, that just about broke up Otis in business. "Ain't a sled girl," says he, "and its name ain't Snow Queen. I'm going to call it Daniel Webster or Oliver Optic or Sheriff Robbins or after some other big man." And the boys plagued him so much about that pesky girl sled that he scratched off the name, and as I remember it, it did go better after that. "About the only thing," continued Joel, "that marred the harmony of the occasion, as the editor of the Hampshire County Phoenix used to say, was the ashes of that Deacon Morris Frisbee sprinkled out in front of the house. He used to say he wasn't going to have folks breaking their neck just on account of a lot of frivolous boys that was going to the gallows as fast as they could. Oh, how we hated him. And we'd have snowballed him, too, if we hadn't been afraid of the constable that lived next door. But the ashes didn't bother us much, and every time we slid side saddle, we'd give the ashes a kick, and that sort of scattered them." The bare thought of this made Santa Claus laugh. "Going on about 9 o'clock, said Joel. "The girls come along. Sister Elvira and Thankful, Prudence Tucker, Belle Yoakum, Sophronie Holbrook, Sis Hubbard, and Marthy Sawyer. Marthy's brother Increase wanted her to ride on his sled, but Marthy allowed that a red sled was her choice every time. "I don't see I'm going to hold on," said Marthy. "Seems as I would have my hands full keeping my things from blowing away." "Don't worry about yourself, Marthy," says I, "for if you'll look after your things, I kind of calculate I'll manage not to lose you on the way." Dear Marthy, seems as if I could see you now with your tangled hair a-blowing in the wind, your eyes all bright and sparkling, and your cheeks as red as apples. Seems, too, as if I could hear you laughing and calling, just as you did as I toiled up the old New England hill that Christmas morning, calling, "Joel, Joel, Joel, ain't you ever coming, Joel?" But the hill is long and steep, Marthy, and Joel ain't the boy he used to be. He's old and gray and feeble, but there's love and faith in his heart, and they kind of keep him tottering toward the voice he hears a-calling, "Joel, Joel, Joel." "I know. I see it all," murmured Santa Claus very softly. "Oh, that was so long ago," sighed Joel. "So very long ago. And I've had no Christmas since, only once, when our little one, Marthy's and mine. You remember him, Santa Claus?" "Yes," said Santa Claus. "A toddling little boy with blue eyes." "Like his mother," interrupted Joel. "And he was like her, too, so gentle and loving. Only we called him Joel, for that was my father's name, and it kind of run in the family. Wasn't more than 3 years old when you came with your Christmas presents for him, Santa Claus. We had told him about you, and he used to go to the chimney every night and make a little prayer about what he wanted you to bring him. And you brought him, too. a stick horse and a picture book and some blocks and a drum. They're on the shelf in the closet there, and his little Christmas stocking with him. I've saved 'em all, and I've taken him down and held him in my hands, oh, so many times. But when I came again, said Santa Claus, his little bed was empty and I was alone. It killed his mother. Marthy was so tender-hearted, and she kind of drooped and pined after that. So now they've been asleep side by side in the burying ground these 30 years. That's why I'm so sad, like, whenever Christmas comes, said Joel, after a pause. The thinking of long ago makes me bitter almost. It's so different now from what it used to be. No, Joel, oh, no, said Santa Claus. 'Tis the same world, and human nature is the same and will always be. But Christmas is for the little folks, and you, who are old and grizzled now, must know it and love it, only through the gladness it brings the little ones. True, groaned Joel, but how may I know and feel this gladness when I have no little stocking hanging in my chimney corner, no child to please me with his prattle? See, I am alone. No, you are not alone, Joel, said Santa Claus. There are children in this great city who would love and bless you for your goodness if you but touch their hearts. Make them happy, Joel. Send by me this night some gift for the little boy in the house yonder. He is poor and sick. A simple toy will fill his Christmas with gladness. His little sister, too. Take her some presents, said Joel. Make them happy for me, Santa Claus. You are right. Make them happy for me. How sweetly Joel slept. When he awoke, the sunlight streamed through the window and seemed to bid him a Merry Christmas. How contented and happy Joel felt. It must have been the talk with Santa Claus that did it all. He had never known a sweeter sense of peace. A little girl came out of the house over the way. She had a new doll in her arms, and she sang a merry little song, and she laughed with joy as she skipped along the street. Ah, and at the window sat the sick little boy, and the toy Santa Claus left him seemed to have brought him strength and health, for his eyes sparkled and his cheeks glowed, and it was plain to see his heart was full of happiness. And oh, how the chimes did ring out, and how joyfully they sang their Christmas carol on that morning. They sang of Bethlehem and the manger and the babe. They sang of love and charity, till all the Christmas air seemed full of angel voices. Carol of the Christmas morn, carol of the Christ child born, carol to the listening sky till it echoes back again. Glory be to God on high, peace on earth, goodwill toward men. So all this music, the carol of the chimes, the sound of the children's voices, the smile of the poor little boy over the way, all this sweet music crept into Joel's heart that Christmas morning. Yes, and with these sweet, holy influence came others so subtile and divine that in its silent communion with them, Joel's heart cried out amen and amen to the glory of Christmas time.